Hello everyone, it's Anthony Wumpstaker speaking now. I used to be the CEO of ME Bank and I'm now a director of SMSF Property. Firstly, I would just like to draw your attention to this slide. First of all, it tells you that the information we give you tonight, we do so as a corporate authorised representative of SMSF Partners Limited, but it's important to understand that we're providing general advice only. We have not taken into account the personal situation of anyone, so we can only give you general advice tonight, and it's in that context that we are going to give you an overview of how our business works. Now, I first came across this business model about a year ago when I was looking for some property investments that would be suitable for my self-managed super fund. After conducting a detailed due diligence on the opportunity that was available at that time, I chose to invest. In the subsequent months, I had numerous conversations with some of the people involved with SMSF Property about the investment model that you'll hear about today. I decided to join the board because I liked the fact that the team at SMSF Property is focused on how to use their property experience to make development profits on behalf of investors. It was what I invested in the first place, and I've found it to be true since I actually joined the company as a director. So without further delay, I would like to introduce Mark and endorse him and recommend him for your consideration tonight.
Hi, warm welcome to everyone that's given us their valuable time to attend tonight's webinar. I really hope you find some of the information we're providing of interest. What I'd like to do to start with is to try and wrap up an idea that what we're here talking about is investment. And I think a good place to start, if we're going to try and define investment and what investment is and how it performs, a good place to start would be to go to the superannuation industry. As most of us know, it holds $1.4 trillion worth of money, and it's being managed by the highest paid experts in Australia. And these funds managers, they study, they work every day, and they really understand how to make investors money. And obviously we're asking now, or not. The Australian superannuation industry is the most leveraged into equities of any superannuation industry in the top 20 OECD countries. So this graph shows that Korea, at the bottom of the graph, is not interested in investing in equities at all. It's interested in investing in bills and bonds and cash. So it's interested in low risk and it's interested in a cash flow. And inversely, as the graph goes up, you find Australia, would you believe, at the top of this list with the most exposure to the stock and equities markets of the top 20 OECD countries. Now, most people would imagine the reason for that is to try and make the most money and the most return on investment. In fact, that particular market over the last 20 years has performed quite well. If our industry, if Australia's investment industry is the most weighted into equities in the world, and over the last 20 years, that particular market has performed quite well, then why is it that historic returns are so low? Alan Kohler in August says, of course, not all that returns dribbled into the members' accounts. The superannuation industry consisting of, let's be particular here, consisting of advisors, platforms, fund managers, and super funds were furiously skimming the accounts and getting gloriously rich. Now that is what we say is broken with the investment industry. The way that money from the investor transfers itself over and over again throughout the industry until it lands in the hands of the people that actually add value and make money. One of the things we all inherently know, just as people, is that money doesn't really make money by itself. Money makes money by being engaged with somebody adding some value. Now, usually those people adding value are workers. They might be workers in China, or they might be workers on an infrastructure project, or they might be workers on a house building project. But really what happens is your investment dollar needs to get to the people actually adding value and making money. But the investment industry doesn't make money that way. It makes money by your money transversing throughout different types of products and different types of entities. Warren Buffett has said money investing is like investing in a bucket, and the bucket keeps being tipped into another bucket. And every time that bucket gets tipped, some water or money is lost. And that's actually what happens, and that's the way the industry is. But we think that's changing. We think the times of these pathetic returns, like 3% over the last 10 years, is changing. Okay, we think there is a white-hot demand for better investment products by the superannuation industry, but the superannuation industry itself is not necessarily going to change, but how it's manifesting itself is by a stampede into self-managed super funds where investors themselves are taking control of their super, and they want to be in control, they want to make their own decisions, and they believe, and in most instances are correct, they'll make a better return on their investment dollars than the industry. So the opportunity really that we're going to talk to you about today is based around these two very specific principles. And both of these principles, before we move on, I really would like you to really grasp and understand. One is that we believe there is an industry that has a massive lack of capital. And whenever you have an industry with a massive lack of capital, that industry is prepared to pay a lot more money for capital than it normally would. So a well-functioning industry that has good capital flow, eventually that capital gets a fairly meager return. An industry that really is in need of capital, it'll fix itself up so that it can actually pay a great return for that capital. We think there is a massive opportunity in the lack of capital available in an industry at the moment. And we also think the lack of investment returns in the superannuation industry is also creating an opportunity, because we've got a massive amount of money that can't find good things to invest in to get a good return. Really, this thinking is based on a couple of things, and this graph represents probably the first thing. Now, the GFC has changed a lot of things. One of the major things that's changed in Australia is represented by this graph. Up until the GFC, which is the left-hand side of the graph, you have business lending tracking alongside residential mortgage lending. And then we have a GFC, and the GFC is marked on this graph where that blue line starts to dip. Now, what this means is that since the GFC, and this is data from the ABS website taken about 3 or 4 days ago, and we update it fairly monthly, nothing much is changing. This divergence of these two lines means that business is getting no money, but residential mortgage lending is continuing to grow. So the banks in Australia, or the investment industry, is interested in loaning money for mums and dads to buy houses. It's not interested in loaning money to developers to build houses. These lines separating is creating an opportunity. This represents an industry that's crying out for capital. This next graph represents the self-managed super fund industry, and it shows the average asset spread, if you like, of the self-managed super fund industry. Now, the only three pies that we're interested in is the self-managed super fund industry, which represents about $450 billion, has about 30% of its money invested in cash. And if I'm talking to people with a self-managed super fund, I'm sure that you'll agree, probably about 30% in shares, and not a great deal of exposure to property, which is represented here by this 13% number. And that's because up until 2007, the self-managed super fund industry was unable to have a great deal of exposure to property as an asset class, because you weren't able to borrow to buy property as an asset. And property has always pretty much required that you're able to bring on some debt. Otherwise, you had to own property 100% outright. What this graph means is, if we removed all barriers of entry in this asset spread, most people would think that that 13% should be sitting at about 35%. What it means over the next 10 years as this pie grows is that there's a really big demand for the self-managed super fund industry to want to get exposure to property. It's actually happening at the moment at about $30 billion a year. What this is creating is a gold rush phase. Okay, now we are in a gold rush phase when it comes to self-managed super funds and property. Those two words alone on Google AdWords have gone up from being worth a few cents 18 months ago to being worth about $6 now for a click. So there's a massive demand for the self-managed super fund industry to get involved and expose itself to property. But remembering the last slide we had, which was a whole industry that is really desperate for capital. This is an industry that's desperate for property investments. That's really why SMSF property exists. Two different industries. One is the property industry, desperate for capital and offering fantastic yields, fantastic profit. And one is SMSF Capital, which is stuck in the investment industry. It's stuck trying to find its way to the property industry. And there's not a great deal of great conduits between the two to allow the efficient flow of capital. So what really is the evolving opportunity for us and for you? And these are the questions you should be asking is what is your opportunity? This graph represents what property development looked like in 1993 when I was involved in the first bunch of projects that I was doing back in 1993, and we're all go back to that recession that Paul Keating said we had to have at the back of 1993. It was just after it had closed. And back in 1993, development sites were very cheap. Now, I want you to imagine that development sites is that pink shaded area, okay? And construction costs were cheap. And construction costs are the yellow area. And what used to happen back there was a very large margin for profit and risk if you were prepared to put the components together. And that is the pink stuff, which was the price you had to pay for a development site. The yellow stuff, which was the price you had to pay the bricklayers and the carpenters. And then you had a profit margin, and the top line represents the retail price of residential dwellings during that period. And yes, it was going up, and it was a reasonable market to operate in. But what was really going up significantly by about 1996, when all the big real estate investment trusts commenced, this was a period where Macquarie Bank invented Urban Pacific. And its charter back then was to go and buy as much land subdivision as it could around Australia. And Macquarie Bank raised lots of money. So did FKP, so did Valad. There was a litany of real estate investment trusts that started in the Australian stock market once we had the superannuation guarantee levy start pouring money into the market. The industry loved property because it was able to invest large chunks of money. But what it did to the acquisition price of development sites, you can see here by that red line above the pink. Development sites went up much faster. There was so much demand for them. They went up much faster than the retail price of the end stock. What that meant was margins were very squeezed. Now, where we sit today is the GFC has wiped out all these companies. Okay, it's wiped out the Urban Pacifics. They don't exist anymore. It's wiped out lots and lots of real estate investment trusts. So there is no competition for development sites anymore. We're back to where it was in about 1993, where development sites are cheap. Construction costs are very much under control. China has contributed a great deal to reducing the cost of construction. And we're back to where retail prices, thanks to that earlier graph where banks are lending to mums and dads to buy stock, we're back to where we've got a very large profit margin. But we still have the problem of not being able to go to the investment industry and get any money. And the opportunity now is crowdfunding. Okay, and crowdfunding is really changing the world. And crowdfunding is, what it really is it's the internet now has the capacity to connect investors with entrepreneurial opportunities. So much so that on April 5th, President Obama signed the Jumpstart Our Businesses Startups Act. Within that act, it had the Crowdfund Act. And this was a very significant event. It actually demonstrates that the internet in the States, certainly, is changing the way normal people can invest in entrepreneurial startups. And it's an example of how the internet is changing the investment paradigm. So what SMSF Property Australia does is we manufacture property. One of the questions you should ask, and we certainly ask, is property a good product to manufacture in a time of uncertainty? In a time where we have fiscal cliff debates in the US, where we're having the European debt problems that we all hear about all the time, we have a great deal of uncertainty. So you've got to decide what business do you want to be in, not what asset classes you want to invest in, but if you want to invest in business, if you want to invest in people that are actually adding value, you've got to try and determine whether or not the product that they're manufacturing and they're trying to sell is any good in a time of uncertainty. So let's look at what happened to the average RP data Rismark capital city dwelling values when we last had the massive GFC economic shock. This is a graph that shows what happened to the stock market versus what happened to the property market. Now, the reason this is important is not because the property market went up. If we're manufacturing a product, we need to know what's the likely price we're going to get for a product that we are manufacturing by the time that product comes to market. If we're manufacturing a product that follows the red line, that's very difficult. We could start manufacturing the red line product in October 07 or January 08, and if it happened to come off the production line in January 09, we would be in a lot of trouble. Nowhere along that blue line is there any problems if the product that we're manufacturing takes 18 months to actually deliver. Quite the opposite. In most cases, along that blue line would be in front. Lots of property investors always want to talk to us about where we see the property market going. To a degree, we're not that interested in where the property market's going. What we're interested in is the price we pay for the components and whether or not there is a market by the time we create and manufacture the product. One of the things about median house price is what affects it. A couple of things that have happened since the GFC on the median house price, which was the blue line that we saw earlier, that went up dramatically when the GFC came in. This is what happened to the median house price. This graph is a bell curve, and this graph represents just a moment in time, just a snapshot of a moment in time. It can be an hour, it can be a day, it can be a month, but what it is, it's a collection of data. And what it really is saying is that there's very few $10 million houses being sold today, and there's very few $150,000 houses sold today. But there is an awful lot of the average price house being sold today, and this is where the median house price comes from. And this is pretty much what the bell curve looked like pre-GFC. There was a few $10 million houses, there was a few $150,000 houses, but there was a lot of average houses. And that's where the average median price came from. And we all know what the GFC did to the $10 million houses. We've all heard the horror stories of Noosa holiday homes being worth $4 million and going to being worth $1.5 million. We've all heard of the Central Coast New South Wales product. We've all heard of the apartments on the Gold Coast going from worth 2 or 3 down to 600,000 or 700,000. So we know that the GFC did a lot of damage to the high end. But if you remember back to that other graph, the average price of residential real estate after the GFC went up. So really what happened to the graph was all those transactions changed, but for the average price to move up, what had to happen was all the actual product that was being traded below that average, it all had to shift. It all had to get higher. We all know the top end collapsed, but what happened was the bottom end moved up, and the bottom end moved up because of Kevin Rudd's stimulus, because of the first home buyer grant, because a $25,000 first home buyer grant has a massive impact on a $300,000 house and has a much less of an impact on a $500,000 house. So the bottom end was oversupplied, it was overbought, and that whole bottom end shifted up. What I think we're seeing now in the median house price is we're seeing that stimulus starting to come out of the bottom end. And so we're seeing a fairly lackluster median price growth. We're seeing it bouncing along in a straight line. But remember, if we're manufacturing a product, we don't care. We just want to make sure that there is a market for it. And if we want to manufacture a product, are we interested in the fact that the government won't let entry-level residential collapse? It's the first thing they'll stimulate if we have an economic shock. The next thing that's important is how we do it. This is where we try and deal with all the issues of security and risk and how it actually works. What we have is we have a structure that is a registered managed fund. So it's registered with ASIC, and with that comes all the Corporations Act requirements of managing a managed fund. So all the investors effectively invest their money into a custodian. Okay, we do not have any debt in our funds. We don't have any, there's no security offered by the investors to any debt provider. Now, not having debt in our funds affects the returns in our funds. The returns within our funds are much less because we don't have debt. All of our investors have over and over again told us that they are not interested in higher returns. They're interested in security and capital protection. They're interested in a structure that does the best job to do that. So we have a custodian, and the custodian is Australian Executor Trustees. We then have a responsible manager, which is SMSF Invest Limited, and then SMSF Property Australia, that's us, and then we have all the service providers. Now this structure goes a long way to protecting the investors' interests, but it does cost money. This structure costs quite a bit of money. The custodian, responsible manager, ourselves, all those particular people take a fee. The difference is the investor's money gets so close to where the value is added and the money's made that all those fees can come out and the investment still returns quite a good yield. So really importantly, what everyone needs to understand is that this model we're talking about, even though we're talking about real estate, most people are thinking that it's a speculative model. It's not a speculative model. We're not being paid, and neither is the capital. The capital is not being paid to speculate. It's being paid to put the bits together. It's being paid because as a crowdsourced funding, we can buy a 35 townhouse site in Brisbane for $60,000 per site. If you were to buy one, it would cost you $250,000. We've just had a question be raised that is there a management expense ratio on these funds? Most managed funds have expenses and management fees and all that come out as a percentage of the funds. What we do is a little different. We actually put together all the costs, and we actually lump all the management fees from the RE and the custodian. We actually put that in the same cost centres as the builder and as the real estate agent and as the marketing expenses. And we wrap up all those expenses together, and we have a managed fund that just does one deal at a time. We put all those costs in, we lock them all down, and then we say, and here is the profit after that. Our development funds, a good example of one of our development funds is a managed fund that's completed now. It's not available for investment, okay? And it's in Manly Road in Brisbane. And it's 35 townhouses. It ended up with 58 individual investors. It was restricted to SMSF funds only. 21 of those individual investors chose to buy 21 of the townhouses that the fund was creating. That was not an obligation. That was the investors approached us and said, we're investing in the fund, but we want to buy the stock. What that meant was the balance of those investors had more of an underwritten return, because quite a lot of the investors in our funds do want to buy the retail residential product. It actually allowed the investors in the fund to use their investment in the fund as a deposit to purchase those townhouses. And those investors that bought those townhouses did very well because they buy at the beginning wholesale price, and they usually get a bit of a discount. And the people that aren't buying the townhouses, they're very happy with that because it actually wraps up the whole deal and wraps up the revenues. Now those people are also communicated to through our website on weekly updates. They get an unfiltered development program on exactly what's happening on their project every single week. We have 0 phone calls about what's going on these developments. They only have to just log into the public website and have a look, and they get real-time views, cash flows monthly. They get to understand where every dollar is being spent and what it's being spent on. The development cash flow is delivering over 53% profit on funds invested. Now, that's over 2 years. So we don't talk about yield, but we do talk about profit. And the reason we talk about profit is because we lock in our costs and we lock in our revenue by deciding what price we're going to sell the assets for. But what's more difficult for us to lock in is time. So we lock in our costs and we lock in what price we're going to sell the assets for that we're creating. And the price we're going to be selling the assets for that we create is usually about 30% more than our costs. The market would have to drop by about 30% before we have any loss. But what else we do is we don't have any debt. So we don't have any pressure to distribute or sell the assets at any time. Another thing that's really interesting about not having debt is that as you sell the stock, the investors get capital distribution. Usually in a development project, the first person to be paid when you develop the product and sell it is the bank. In our funds, because there is no bank, when we sell an asset, if that money is surplus cash to the project, it gets distributed. Another reason we don't talk about yield is because as the money comes in, it gets distributed as capital back. So working out the profit is much simpler than working out the yield. Another key concept to understand in what we choose to do and our philosophy is we do not own our projects before the investors buy them. This is a big key difference between lots of other development managers in the past where they might buy a project and then sell it into a fund. We don't do that. So what we do is we scour the market for opportunities and we map it out into an algorithm, and we're continually going to the market and we're continually making offers on projects. And what we're looking to do is to buy just DA approved projects at a great big discount to valuation. And we're looking for different markets and different times. We're always going to the market, always looking for product. Once we find a development that we are happy with, what we then do is we take an option on that project, and then we float the project, the whole concept, through a PDS, through our website, with a totally transparent model where we show all the approvals, the cash flows, the fixed price construction contracts, every piece of data we can possibly get together, we put all on the website, and then all the investors, the investment collective then decide whether or not that project is worth doing. If they decide that the project is worth doing, the fund effectively closes and the fund then buys the project and proceeds on. That is how we do it. This is the current project that we have open today. The development funds are only open for a very short period of time, and this is the project we have open at the moment. It's a project that was a casualty of the GFC. It's a project that went broke after it built stage 1 and stage 2, and we have picked up the balance of the project. We've picked up the balance of the project. The houses in the first stage sold for $750,000, and we're selling our product for $440,000. We're picking up a project where the last time the land sold, it sold for $9.2 million in 2003, and we're buying the balance of the project for $2.7 million. And in that time, the previous developer has brought the sewer in, they've completed electrical infrastructure, and they've added an awful lot of value to this land, and we're picking it up at that. And the reason we're picking up at that is because of the development industry has got no money. This project is being bought at a very cheap price in a market that has got a great chance of capital growth. And we believe we've bought this project at the bottom of the market in this particular local area. This is a slide that shows the existing homes in stage 1, stage 1 and 2, and then you've got the balanced land that we're purchasing. And interestingly, a lot of our stock is backing onto conservation land. This is all conservation land. The other houses within this particular estate, which is at Peregian Springs, it's an FKP estate that's won quite a few different urban awards. The housing that has backed onto conservation land throughout their estate in the past has historically got 20% more than the blocks of land that were backing onto just other houses. We haven't allowed for any price growth based on that concept. Another one of the reasons we really like this area at the moment is because of the lack of supply in this particular zone. This slide is a slide of the draft South East Queensland Regional Plan that was stamped in 2009. And what each one of those areas is a South East Queensland local government area. Where it says number 14 is where Brisbane is. Now, most people think of South East Queensland and they think of beach lifestyle, they think of nice white sandy beaches. But the reality is the only beaches that exist in South East Queensland are contained within the bottom red circle and the top purple circle. So if you live in Brisbane and you want to drive to a beach, you have to go to the Gold Coast, which is at the tip of the bottom red circle, or you have to drive north to Caloundra, which is at the bottom of the top purple circle. Another really interesting aspect of this plan, which is the state government deciding on where all the people are going to be living over the next 20 years, is that they have determined in that bottom red circle, there's going to be 1.5 million people. In the top purple circle, they've determined 750,000. But in that top red circle, they've only allowed about 60,000 people. That top red circle represents all the land between Noosa and the Maroochydore River. The purple circle contains the new hospital, the biggest public-private partnership infrastructure project in Australia. The top red circle has got golf courses and very little land supply. I really believe that this is a town planning error, that they are allocating 30% of South East Queensland's beach space and they're only allowing 1.7% of the population, expected population, to live there. We believe that at some stage between now and the next 10 years, the market, once it recovers from an employment point of view, will start to understand this anomaly and will start to pay some real value for land in this particular zone. Our project sits right in the middle between Maroochydore and Noosa. That piece of land at Peregrine Springs, as you can see, is the only land that's had development approval on the western side of the Sunshine Coast motorway. All the other land area the state government has determined will be built on is on the eastern side. And there's a very, very small amount of it. This parcel of land is contained within a project known as Peregrine Springs. Peregrine Springs has a golf course. It has one of the Sunshine Coast's best private schools, which is called St Andrews. It has the state government's new smart school, which is a primary school. It's got a shopping centre. It's got a great deal of infrastructure, and our project is only 3 kilometres to one of those beaches that we're talking about. And Noosa is 15 minutes to the north. And all of that land that you can see down the right-hand side there that backs onto the conservation land, that's the land that was sold for 20% more than the land across the road when it was sold. So the market wants to live on blocks of land that back onto that conservation land. All that green land you can see all around this particular project, none of that is able to be developed. This slide represents how good the buying is in the current market. So we have an option to purchase this land for 2.7 million. We forwarded that option in the contract to an independent valuer that's valuing it for the funds manager. Okay, so the funds manager that's involved requires that all the assets are independently valued. This particular valuer has valued the site that we're buying at $3.4 million, which is, and we're paying $2.7 million for it. That shows you how cheaply you can buy development sites at the moment because of the lack of capital. The product that has been built in stage 1 and stage 2 needs us to come on board and fix it up and build the health and wellbeing centre and get the golf course access started and change the tone and feel of the project, because as we said, it's a project gone broke. These are some images of the first stage that was developed. This project has really good bones, okay? It needs makeup, but it has really good bones. It's got golf course access, it's close to the beach, it's got great infrastructure around it, it's got conservation land all around it, and it's got good architecture. It needs better marketing, better branding, and it needs a developer that's not strapped for cash. This here is the entry that's completed and built. And that's stage one as you can see it, and that's all the conservation land. We've allowed in the cash flow, which is downloadable from our website and is a very important document to read and understand, we've allowed that we're spending $35,000 to improve all the landscaping and the entry to stage one, to reband the project. In summary, this project is a land subdivision of 66 lots. The purchase price we're paying for this land subdivision means that we're paying $40,000 per lot. The cost to develop each lot is $43,000. The cost in headworks to pay council to get the title is $28,000. Effectively, the cost to create each block of land is about $110,000. The independent valuer has valued the land at average price about $220,000. Now, if I said to most people you could buy a block of land and develop it and have it all done for 110, it's worth 220, most people would do it. The problem is you can't do one. You have to be part of a crowd-funded development where you have to buy the whole 66. Another good thing about the land subdivision is this particular cash flow has a 12-month capital distribution. So the funds manager is going to be looking to start distributing capital back to the investors after 12 months. And the profit on investment currently is 44%. Now, if you compare this product, this investment product, to any other product you might be looking at, a share or just a straight out capital property purchase, these numbers here on this page reflect zero price growth. So if you compare this product to another kind of share acquisition program or something, just make sure that what you understand is that these particular numbers that are contained in the cash flow mean we are expecting zero price growth from the bottom of the market. As it's a land subdivision, it also has quite a few interesting characteristics. Land subdivisions are very, very much sought after by the big property players, and that is because they have a very low capital entry, meaning once you've bought the whole paddock, the amount of money it costs to actually develop a block of land is very small. Usually the big players like to buy land subdivisions because in the first year or so they might not make a profit, but what they like to see happen is some capital growth over the period of the land subdivision, and that leverages your returns dramatically. Land subdivisions also come with very low construction risk because constructing a road is a lot easier than constructing a dwelling. So because the fund is literally rolling out a land subdivision, it has a much lower construction risk. We have very low holding risk. In a land subdivision, in our projects we have time risk. Because we don't have debt, the only thing we have is time risk. If you're in a land subdivision and you're trying to sell your assets for a certain price and the sales rate slows and you have to hold it, your only costs is lawn mowing. You don't have buildings that are deteriorating. So on this particular land subdivision, if we get any kind of capital growth, then it will have a dramatic effect on the investment returns to the investors. Okay, so if we have an average price growth of 10%, if our average price of the whole dwellings in the area, because we're selling land, but we need the price of dwellings to go up in order for our land price to go up. But if we have a 10% increase in the dwelling price, it will change our returns to the landowners from 2.7 million to 6 million on a $6 million investment. That is what really happens with a land subdivision. One of the questions we have is, why aren't the banks willing to lend to projects like this? It's not really that the banks aren't willing to lend to projects like this or any other kind of project, but the banks really don't have a great deal of capital. That is why they're paying the highest rates they can for depositors to get their hands on capital. And property is an industry that takes a lot of capital. So it's not that the banks aren't specifically wanting to lend on this type of project. They're actually just not willing to lend on the whole industry as a whole. And those sorts of decisions aren't made at the lender's level or at the manager's level where they actually look at a particular project and decide. It's made at more of a board level. We want our property book to be smaller. We don't lend to property developers anymore, full stop. We want to lend to mums and dads buying the stock. I think this will backfire on the banks, especially if crowdfunding starts to get a hold in a market that they've usually made quite a lot of profit in.
Can I say something about that, Mark, too? Just based on my experience from being the CEO of a bank, you look at your exposure to property generally, and as your graph showed earlier in the presentation, the banks are getting plenty of property exposure just by lending to individuals who are buying their own house. And so to some extent, that business lending line, which has flatlined since the global financial crisis, represents the fact that the banks have been keen to unwind their development property exposure. They've, on balance, probably increased their exposure to real estate, but they've done that through lending to individuals. So they've been quite happy to increase their exposure to individual borrowers, but to get their total property exposure down a bit, they've been willing to, or they've wanted to reduce their exposure to property developments. And that's been a noticeable feature of what's happened in banking and lending to this sort of thing. So it's not so much that any individual deal doesn't work for them, it's that their book as a whole has to have reduced exposure to property, and the way that they've elected to do that is to reduce the lending to property developers whilst continuing to lend money to individuals. I also noticed that there was a question from somebody about whether there are franking credits on the distributions, and the answer is yes. To the extent that the part of the distributions will represent profit on the project and tax will be paid on those, there will be franking credits associated with those distributions.
Another question we've got is, would I classify this particular development as a low, medium, or high risk? Okay, I would like every investor that invests in our managed funds to really get a real understanding of what we're actually doing, and they would be able to really answer the question themselves. So what we're really doing is we are buying an opportunity. You think of it this way: we're buying an opportunity where the first thing we're doing is buying a block of land that an independent valuer has said is worth $3.4 million. Now we all know that something's only worth what you can get someone to pay. Okay, but to begin with, we're buying a block of land that a valuer has said worth 3.4, and we're paying 2.7 for it. So on day one, the investors own a block of land and they own a bunch of cash in the bank. Okay, so they own a bunch of cash in the bank. The money that's in the bank is earning, a usual cash return. Then what we start to do is we start to improve that asset. Now the risk is in whether or not the money we're spending in improving that asset is actually adding value to it. Now the things we do to do that is we use an independent valuer to decide on how we're improving it. We use an independent quantity surveyor to sign off on the money that we're actually spending on the asset. But to begin with, it's fairly simple. We're going to buy this block of land. We're going to start to build other blocks of land, and we know exactly how much money that's going to cost. Once we've done that, then those assets are on the market. Okay. Now, the next thing is there is no one that can take those assets off the investors. The investors will own all those assets. So it's very difficult for me to see how there is a threat to capital, especially when we're trying to produce product, and we're trying to produce product to be 30% less than what a valuer has told us it's going to be worth. Okay, so there's various risks in that question. Is there a risk to liquidity? Property is not a very liquid asset. Okay, it has better that red line that showed the stock market collapsing, but it's a much more liquid asset than property. The investors will own this property, and if they can't sell it for the price that they want to make that margin, there'll be no one telling them they have to. Okay, it'll be up to them. So really what we talk about in our projects is the risk is time. It's not really anything else but time. It's really about time risk. We obviously try and mitigate the time risk by managing the projects properly and professionally and using the right people. We also try and mitigate the time risk by selling the assets at the right price, and we've got a marketing budget to do so. So, my view is that these sorts of projects have a low risk for the capital exposure. A couple of other questions is the minimum investment. The minimum investment in these managed funds is $5,000. Okay, so effectively it's crowdfunded by lots and lots of people who are putting up equity only, with remembering no debt, and they're doing it by way of investing as little as $5,000. Now, our average investment in these funds seems to be about $75,000. I think that most people, once they actually engage and they really take the time to view the website and read all the material, read the feasibility, get a really good understanding of what's happening, I think once they've done that, they tend to understand a little bit better, and the average investment becomes about $75,000. Another question we've got there is the forecasted IRR and sales. There is a document on the website. That's a sophisticated question, and it's actually answered much better than I can answer it now in the actual cash flow. So there is a document, because this is not a managed fund that just doesn't know what it's doing. Like lots of managed funds say things like this: we're going to go and buy hospitals and we're going to manage them and run them, and we think we can make this kind of return. Okay, that is not what we are saying. What we are saying is we're going to go and buy this block of land. It costs this amount of money. We're going to lay this brick on this day. We're going to lay this brick on this day. We're going to plant this tree on this day, and then we're going to sell this asset that we've created on this day. And we have actually mapped out this whole project from start to finish with all costs, and it sits within a cash flow and a feasibility on a software called Estate Master. It is sitting on our website now for the download. There is a video on the website that explains the document that you need to spend about 10 minutes watching, and then you will be able to have a really good understanding of the cash flow. And that's a really good document to understand. It has all the IRRs in it, and it has all the assumptions in it, and it has how many lots we're going to sell in the first 6 months and how many we're going to sell after and what price we're going to sell them at. And the important part to that document, though, in my view, is that it has no price growth. Okay, so as we map out this project, we are saying zero price growth. I think all our projects are different. Every single development we do is nuanced in a very specific way. Some are short term, some have a high exposure to a super profit, some have a less of exposure to a super profit, but they're more consistent in the market as far as sales volume and sales rate. Okay, so all of that information really is contained within the feasibility. Another question is, how many vacant blocks are still for sale in stages 1 and 2? There is 8 blocks of land for sale in stages 1 and 2, and the owner of those blocks we have spoken to, and the last 3 transactions for those sold at about $220,000. They know that we're about to undertake all this improvement to the project. They know that we're about to build the Health and Wellbeing Centre, that we're about to provide the golf club access, and quite obviously that's the previous, and they're not interested in selling these lots until we start to add this value. So once we start to add this value and start getting this project up and running and marketed properly, then they will obviously then sell those lots to the market. That won't really get in the way of our sales because we won't have product on the market, on the ground to sell for quite a while yet, for probably around about the 8 months or 9 month mark. We do get asked the next question quite a bit as to whether or not we have development projects in other states. We have an accountant network that supports our development funds. We get quite a lot of support from Melbourne. We get quite a lot of support from Perth. We have representatives in all these states to talk to any investors that might be from those states. Anthony is from Melbourne. Our head office is in Brisbane. At the moment, we are kept really busy with the amount of developments we can bring to market, and that's in this Brisbane, Queensland area. We do have our eyes on a project in Melbourne, and we hope to bring that one to the market in about March. We look forward to that, but at the moment, all of our projects are in Queensland. Next question is, when would this project commence? This project will commence the day after the capital is raised. So our projects always pretty much settle within about 48 hours of the last dollar of capital being raised. Okay, so once that, and we line it all up so that we can commence instantly after that. So this project will commence within a couple of days of the capital being raised. Thank you very much for the time you've given us tonight, and we would love it if you would just fill in the questionnaire that will appear in your screens in a moment. Thank you very much. We'll hear from you soon.